Good morning to everybody. Good evening for who is watching us from Europe. This is Stefano Mazarin from Italy. Today we will have our guest Alex Kokcharov from UK. That is like a S&P global analyst. Specialized in Eastern Europe and Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and all this zone. I will give to him fastly the stand. If you have any question for him, just put in the comments or in the chat. I will collect all the questions as usual, and we will make a question and answer panel after his speech. So, Alex, I will give to you immediately the stand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefano. Thank you for having me on this program. It's really great to be invited. So today I wanted to discuss what can we expect in terms of Russia-Ukraine war, and which is ongoing. The large-scale Russian invasion began just more than 6 months ago. Yesterday was exactly 6 months. But the wider war has been going on since 2014. First, obviously, with the Russian occupation and annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Eastern Ukraine, which was a hybrid warfare conducted by Russia, but where Russia maintained plausible deniability, claiming that it was not a party to that conflict, but rather was supporting local separatist militias. But by February 2022, all masks were off, and Russia opted to invade Ukraine openly, and it used multiple justifications to why it did so. Initially, Putin claimed that the objective was to conduct demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. That's his quote. But already in June, Putin admitted publicly that this was a war of territorial conquest. He said that Russia was simply fighting in order to regain previously lost lands. And these are mostly in eastern and southern Ukraine. Based on what we see, the initial objective of Russia in Ukraine was really far-reaching. We're planning to capture the national capital, Kyiv, and to install a pro-Russian government, thus capturing control of either all of Ukraine or significant parts of the country, perhaps maybe with the exception of western regions. But this failed, and as a result, Russia is now trying to capture all of the Donbas region, Donetsk and Luhansk. Russia fully captured Luhansk region on 3rd of July, but its offensive in the Donetsk region has been incredibly slow, with very little progress in the past 4 weeks. So just to give you perspective, as of 6th of July, Russia controlled 21.1% of Ukrainian territory. And as of 25th of August, Russia controls 21.17% of Ukrainian territory. So it only managed to capture very little territory in the meantime, despite the ongoing heavy losses. What can we expect, say, in the next 6 months? There are obviously multiple scenarios. I've seen pieces of analysis which go and talk about 5 potential scenarios, even 15 potential scenarios, but I will focus on 3. I think the most likely scenario would be a stalemate or a ceasefire, whatever you want to call it, with the significant cost of the war for both Russia and for Ukraine, both in terms of military losses, but also the economic impact will push both parties to the negotiating table. We see that Russia is already indicating that it wants to negotiate. There have been multiple indicators of that, including the visit of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, first to Sochi in Russia on 5th of August to have talks with Putin, and then to Lviv in Ukraine on 18th of August to have talks with Ukraine's President Zelensky. It looks like that Ukraine is not interested in the talks on Russian terms, and it wants to improve its negotiating position by either weakening Russian military position on the battlefield or to regain territory before it engages in negotiations. But the reality of multiple constraints for both Russia and Ukraine, which are different, but nevertheless are present, I think will likely push both sides towards negotiating table eventually. Will it be successful or not? I don't know. But I think it is a fair assumption that there will be some sort of talks taking place, which would probably freeze the conflict at certain positions, and would give a pause to both Ukraine and to Russia. There would be positives and negatives for both parties. For Ukraine, the main negative would be that significant parts of territory, including population centers, would remain outside of Ukrainian territorial control, a de facto control, and would be under de facto Russian control. But the Ukrainian economy would be able to reopen, and post-war reconstruction would be able to begin. However, the problem with this scenario is that it doesn't end the conflict; it only delays the resolution to a later, yet unspecified date. And all parties understand it. That's why all parties will probably be seeking other scenarios, at least for now. And these are maximalist scenarios. One would be Russia defeating Ukraine, where Russia would use significant escalation, which can take form of either a significant deployment of fresh troops, which can come from either redeployment of Russian troops from elsewhere in Russia, or mobilization conducted in Russia, which would be used to move the front lines in Russia's favor, potentially cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea, or potentially even threatening Kiev, the capital, with another assault, basically a repeat of what has happened in February, March. Another alternative option would be Russia opting for use of CBRN weapons, chemical, biological, radioactive, nuclear. That would be a very dangerous escalation, because these types of weapons can cause very significant damage, and that damage can cause problems across international borders. So, for instance, in a situation where Russia would choose to use nuclear weapons, radioactive contamination can travel across international borders and contaminate areas outside of Ukraine, for instance. And that can potentially even include Russia itself, but also NATO member states which border Ukraine, such as Romania or Poland or Hungary or Slovakia. And if this were to happen, we would be in uncharted territory of NATO feeling that they must respond in one way or another to this Russian action. Another scenario would be Russian defeat, where the continued supply of weapons by the West and also combined with financial assistance to Ukraine combined with military training, with intelligence sharing, would lead to the Ukrainian forces conducting successful counter offensives against the Russian forces, and as a result, regaining significant parts of territory, or making positions of Russian forces untenable, similarly to what has happened near Kiev in earlier this year, forcing them to withdraw to the positions, say, before 24th of February 2022, meaning to Crimea and to Donetsk and Luhansk. That would be obviously a very, a scenario which would be very much welcome in Ukraine. And a lot of Ukrainian people I know hope for this scenario. But for this scenario to be successful, Ukraine would need to significantly increase its military capabilities, including to obtain large numbers of offensive types of weapons, including main battle tanks, armored vehicles, combat helicopters, combat fixed-wing aircraft, and so on, which would allow Ukraine to effectively conduct such counteroffensives in large areas, especially in southern and eastern Ukraine. And these will be difficult areas because these are flat steppe landscapes where if you are advancing, you are very much visible to your enemy. So these are potential scenarios. I view Russian defeat or Russian victory as probably low likelihood scenarios. And I think the more likely scenario is that we're going to see a protracted, indecisive conflict, which will eventually force the parties to negotiate and to agree to some sort of ceasefire, which will not end the conflict, but would significantly reduce the level of kinetic fighting and kinetic military activity, thus allowing for some restoration of peaceful life and post-war reconstruction of the economy, which is especially something that will be needed in Ukraine, whose economy has suffered greatly due to the sheer scale of physical destruction caused by Russian strikes, but also due to dislocation of labor, with more than 6.5 million Ukrainians currently outside of Ukraine in various countries of Europe, and about 10 million displaced internally within Ukraine. Economy cannot function when such a great proportion of population, more than a third of population, is displaced and is away from their normal homes and normal places of residence. So this is an introduction, and I'd be happy to take any questions so that we can be as interactive as possible.
So let's start. I collect some question before, but I have already from the public. Web Union that is also one of our streamers. So, do you think a peace deal is possible at all? It seems Russia wants some territorial gains, while Ukraine considers that is a red line.
I think in the scenario of a ceasefire, it will only be a temporary solution, but these temporary solutions can last for a very long time. I'm skeptical there can be a peace deal because, according to opinion polls in Ukrainian general public does not support territorial concessions in exchange for peace with Russia. 81% of Ukrainians who polled say no. And that's the reason why the Ukrainian government would be unlikely to accept territorial concessions, to agree to territorial concessions to Russia, because Ukraine, however imperfect, is a democracy where governments are elected and presidents are elected. So they need to check with the general public and with the sentiment of the majority of population. So if a clear majority say that territorial concessions to Russia given Ukrainian lands to Russia is not an acceptable scenario. No Ukrainian government would agree to that. Again, this might change in case if Russia escalates significantly, using much more deadly weapons, which would cause large-scale losses of civilians. That would have potential to change the public opinion. But based on what we see now, it's extremely unlikely. Again, even if de facto Russia maintains control of parts of southern and eastern Ukraine through a ceasefire, and even if Russia conducts this referenda and announces annexation of, say, Donetsk and Luhansk, and maybe even Kherson, this will not be recognized by international community. This will not be recognized by Ukraine. So Russian claims, from the legal standpoint, will be very, very vague and baseless. The rest of the world will not be viewing these territories as Russia.
Perfect. So next one. How much longer can the West supply Ukraine with weapons and economic help with how affected they are by the current recession?
It's a good question. It appears that the US administration is clearly demonstrating that it is willing to provide long-term commitment to Ukraine in terms of both military and financial assistance. Just yesterday, US President Biden announced nearly $3 billion in a fresh package of military assistance to Ukraine, which includes some advanced weapons systems. And this is the largest of packages provided by the US. Before the announcement, US provided more than $10 billion since February in security assistance to Ukraine. So now we're talking about more than $13 billion. And we see that a number of other NATO member states have provided Ukraine with weapons. And this includes UK, Poland, Netherlands, Czechia, Spain. Germany announced a package of military assistance for 2023 yesterday. It's a separate package of €500 million. So far, I see that there is a commitment in the West to continue supplying Ukraine with weapons, because it is my understanding that the politicians in the West realize very well that if Russia is allowed to take an upper hand in Ukraine and to achieve its political goals, to subjugate Ukraine with the use of force, it would open pathways where more countries in Europe would be threatened by Russian force. And that can include NATO and EU member states, which would ultimately lead to a direct conflict between Russia and NATO. So from the perspective of Western politicians, even the significant financial assistance and military assistance to Ukraine is still way cheaper than engaging in a direct war with Russia. So I think that at least for a year, maybe more, we're going to see that. We're going to see that continuing.
Connection with this question, in event on a gas interruption by Gazprom through Nord Stream 1, but for example now it will be technically for maintenance for 3 days, but let's see if it will be reactivated or not. How do you think that Europe can respond given the dependence of Russian gas?
I'm not an energy specialist, so I will not go into great detail here, but we know that Russia uses energy and gas supplies as a method of political blackmail and a foreign policy tool. It has used it in the past, and it's likely to use it in the future. So it was quite short-sighted for a number of EU member states to rely so heavily on Russia as their energy provider, especially after 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine. I would have expected that the politicians in the West would have woken up in 2014 and realized that you can no longer trust Russia and that you can no longer rely on it as a supplier of critical imports such as gas. But it wasn't the case. So there is a degree of leverage for Russia. But there is an understanding that this can happen, and politicians in Europe are making plans, contingency planning for an event of this sort, so that the general public would not be affected. Who will be affected, of course, would be industry, because industry is a very significant user of natural gas. So any supply of natural gas will critically impact a number of industries, especially in the chemical sector.
Alex, if I can show you like fastly this map, because the main problem for me, like the two weak countries are Germany and Italy, because Germany is dependent more than 50%. Italy was 40, now less than 20, but I can show you my point of view so you can answer, because the main problem is the quantity, because fastly it's very difficult to don't take at all 155 billion cubic meters of Russian gas. This is written 140, but we have also 15 of LNG. So the main thing is that, like, in my opinion, I think that UK and Norway will have the huge responsibility for the north to provide gas to Germany, but it's not enough. And Germany have not responded with LNG port. They don't have it. Like Italy, for example, could be like a good answer, but also we are exchanging Russia with Algeria, but it's still a Russian allied, and with Azerbaijan, but it's very, let's say, threatenable by Russia, because it has borders with Russia in the north. Technically is like also a partner, and so this is the question was about the problem that we can find some let's say alternative, but in a short term, for example, today the gas hit the record of 315 euro for megawatt hour, and the bills, for example, for the companies and industries now are eight times more than last year in Italy.
Yeah.
So it's
I mean, it is obviously a very challenging situation for the industry with the energy prices of this sort, and there is a genuine situation, that genuine challenge. How can you replace Russian gas so quickly? But there are already contingency plans being put in place by EU politicians, EU decision making. I'm not looking at gas markets in great detail in my work, so I don't want to go in great detail. But
okay, perfect.
Obviously, Russia has used it as a foreign policy tool in the past, so it is quite likely to use it as a foreign policy tool in the future. And we know, for instance, that when Finland formally applied to join NATO, one of the first things Russia did was to suspend supply of natural gas to Finland, which wasn't critical for Finland because it was a relatively small source of gas and energy for the Finnish energy balance. But Russia has been doing it and Russia has discontinued its supply of gas to a number of EU states earlier this year, starting with Poland and Bulgaria.
But
And,
also
and
like
then
to
Denmark and Netherlands as well.
agree to, if you look to the map, like the gas in Italy, it's arriving from Friuli, Venezia Giulia, in one town
Yep.
that it's called Tarvisio, and the day after the collapse of the Italian government of Draghi, magically the gas increased in Tarvisio 70% plus. So it's pretty obvious that also the gas supplies are used as a political way of leverage. So like, just to give you the next one, this is technical for you. Like, why do you think that Russia hasn't declared war and still in a specially military operation?
I think, declaring a war is very much a 19th century concept. A lot of recent wars have been waged without a country declaring a war. The Soviet Union never declared war in Afghanistan, but there was a war in Afghanistan where the Soviet army was taking a very active role for nearly 10 years. So it's a very much kind of 19th century theatrics of declaring a war. A lot of wars in recent decades have been effectively conducted without declaring a war. I think the main objective for the Kremlin is to not put the country on war footing, because they want to present the appearance of normalcy, that everything is as usual, nothing extraordinary is happening, that there is something going on, outside of the country. It's limited. It's only affects, very small areas and very small types of assets. Russia claims that it only strikes on military targets, that it doesn't strike on civilian targets and spares civilians, which is not factually correct, because based on the monitoring we see, Russia has conducted strikes with air strikes or missile strikes or shelling strikes 60 times more often on civilian objects, everything from houses to bridges to schools to hospitals, libraries, and so on, to 60 times more often on civilian objects than on military targets. So, but this information is not spread in Russia and would be considered illegal in Russia. So Russians who live in Russia, many of them do not know about these facts, and they think that Russia is conducting just war against some nationalists in Ukraine. So that's probably the objective, to present that everything is as usual, business as usual, life goes on, nothing changes domestically. Because for the Kremlin, it's important to maintain an image of domestic cohesion, that there is a cohesive society which is not divided, and that everyone is on the same page. They really want to project this image both within the country and to the outside world.
Okay. This is like very specific, but I collect before. In your opinion, what active role could Poland have in a war scenario, and above it all in a post-war scenario? And connected to this question, this other question, do you think that Ukraine, Belarus, Poland water route, the A40 project, as a future?
I don't think that Poland would be acting unilaterally here, and it would check any of its action through the framework of NATO. In the early days of the war, of this large-scale campaign, when Russia threatened to conduct strikes on military convoys from NATO member states, such as Poland and Romania, into Ukraine, there was a lot of concern that, what would happen if a Russian missile would land on the border with Poland or within the Polish territory. There have been several Russian military strikes really close to the Polish border, just 15, 20 kilometers away. But I think whatever Poland would do, it would be not a unilateral action, but a joint action agreed within the NATO framework. Poland would not conduct, in my view, any action without first receiving, support from its key NATO allies, particularly US and UK. In terms of post-war reconstruction and post-war situation, we obviously don't know, what will be the situation, when the conflict ends. But it's quite likely that, Ukraine will continue increasing its military cooperation with NATO. We already know that thousands of Ukrainian servicemen are being trained in NATO member states, in the UK, in Poland, in Romania. And this will only be increasing. The exchange in terms of training and access of Ukrainian forces to Western trainers and Western technology, Western weapons, joint manufacturing, all of this is something that would be likely happening. Ukraine clearly attached itself to the West. It has been drifting in that direction for a very long time. Then in the past 8 years, we've seen that it clearly said that we want to be part of the West, we want to be part of EU and NATO, and the general public in Ukraine, the public sentiment has shifted. And now Ukraine is increasingly relying on NATO standard weapons, because a lot of its own production facilities of the military defense complex have been damaged or destroyed by Russian strikes. And as a result, domestic manufacturing, which used to produce Soviet-era standard weapons, is no longer there or is not functioning. So over time, I think Ukraine will be very much tied in terms of military cooperation with NATO, and particularly with its immediate neighbors in NATO, such as Poland, and I think in Romania as well, but probably Poland to a much higher degree. In regards to the E40 waterway, it can only be realized, first if/when the war in Ukraine has ended and there are no Russian forces on the banks of the Dnieper River. And currently, as we know, the lower reaches of the Dnieper River, including Kherson, are under the Russian control. This is condition number one. Condition number two, I don't think this project is realistically can be realized as long as Lukashenko remains the de facto ruler of Belarus. Belarus is under international sanctions. Belarus was a staging point for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Belarus is still used as a staging point for missile launches, Russian missile launches on Ukrainian targets, with the latest one taking place yesterday on Ukraine's Independence Day. So Ukraine obviously will not be cooperating with Belarus for as long as Lukashenko is in power. And I don't know when he's no longer be in power. He's been in power for more than 28 years now, and he clearly demonstrated that he is willing to use overwhelming repression against mass uprisings of Belarusians. More than 1 million Belarusians have protested in 2020 against stolen election, and police brutality. That's a very significant number for Belarus, which only has 9 million of population. But these protests were inconclusive, and they ended because of the very repressive response from the police and security forces, who used torture and brutality and even killings of activists in order to suppress the protests. So for as long as Lukashenko is in power, I think neither Poland nor Ukraine will be interested in having this route operational.
This one it's about UK, but you are like where you are located. The chief of staff of the UK Army announced that the UK needs to mobilize their military and prepare for war in Europe. Do you think that's a general stance in the most European countries now? And in completing this question, similar to German escalation of a 100 billion euro investment into their military.
I think the first one, it was never formally announced. It was, I think that was based on what the British tabloids have said, citing questionable sources. I can easily imagine that there is an official talk about potential deployments of UK troops to other places happening. But also, you know, what we see, the response of NATO to the Russian invasion of Ukraine was to increase the military presence on the eastern flank, you know, all the way from Estonia to Romania, with increased deployments of troops, of advanced weapons, and increased intelligence sharing. So I think what we are going to see in the coming years is increased military spending, defense spending, especially in countries which are close to Russia. This includes Baltics, this includes Poland, Romania, and countries like Germany would have to increase their share as well, because there is an understanding that military risks in Europe, of a major conflict in Europe, have been underestimated, and a major war in Europe can happen, and it brings with itself spillover risks to even a wider, a bigger conflict. I'm still skeptical that we're going to see it in, say, 12-month outlook, a bigger conflict outside of, which would spill outside of Ukrainian borders. But there are pathways and scenarios which can lead to such a conflict, and the likelihood of those is above zero. It's fairly small, I would say, maybe 15 or 20%, but it's not zero. So everybody is trying to get prepared.
So another one that is like from collected before. What do you think about the real sanction effect of the Russian economy? Because there are many bells about this. I have like direct contact in Russia. There is, in my opinion, and then I will listen to your opinion, there is two complete different Russia. The people who didn't travel in Russia doesn't know. Moscow and Peter and the rest of Russia. So what we see from television, it's mainly Moscow, but the effect in the suburbs and in the other cities are much different. So if you can answer about this one.
Well, the way sanctions work, they never have an immediate impact. It's always about longer-term influences caused by restrictions. So, for instance, the sanctions, the EU sanctions, which will ban imports of crude oil, seaborne crude oil from Russia into the EU, were approved by the EU on 31st of May, but they will only come into effect on 5th of December. So a lot of the sanctions, they have been introduced in a staged manner to allow businesses to prepare for these trade restrictions to be in place. So it never happens immediately. It's not like a switch. You switch a sanction and everything goes dark. So all the economists I spoke to, they were saying, even in the beginning of this large-scale war, that Russia will start feeling real effect of sanctions only towards the autumn. So about 6 months, into the first sanctions being introduced. I've seen various economic forecasts, and all of them, they differ in terms of the depth of what would be the contraction of Russian GDP. But they all are unanimous that the deepest contraction will take place between the October of this year and March next year. So fourth quarter this year and first quarter 2023. So we are yet to see the real impacts of sanctions. And another element here is not just the sanctions. We also have witnessed the large-scale corporate exodus, with more than 1,000 multinational firms opting to leave Russia or significantly restrict their presence in Russia, which will have an impact on employment and jobs and innovation transfer, because a lot of the firms will no longer be in Russia. They will not be bringing best practices, best technology, best equipment into the country, and as a result, the economy will become much more outdated and will not function as well as it used to. For instance, just to give you an example, Boeing and Airbus can no longer service aircraft which are in Russia due to the impact of sanctions. So what the Russian airlines would have to do, they would have to service them themselves, and they would have to use some of their aircraft for parts. They will be cannibalizing their aircraft for parts so that the remaining aircraft would be flying. And it's like, it's something that will have an impact eventually. It will not be immediate. For instance, there was a Western factory which was producing some food, which is not impacted by sanctions, but the company decided to leave Russia and sold it to some local businessman for, I don't know, 100 euros or 1,000 euros. And in the beginning, everything is fine. But then the equipment, the production line starts malfunctioning. But it cannot be serviced because it was made in Italy or in Germany or in South Korea or in Japan. And what happens? Probably local engineers will fix some small bugs, but it will be less productive and effective over time. And generally, the productivity levels will be impacted, but again, over time. So what's going to be happening with Russia? It will be slow decline, economic decline, which will make it, less of an economic power. And it will be economically isolated, with Western businesses, multinationals, avoiding presence in Russia. And as a result, Russia will not be receiving the innovation and technology which it got used to over the past 30 years, when it was fully integrated into the global economy and had presence of all the multinationals from various countries, US, Europe, Japan, which were bringing expertise, best practices, and everything else. So it's not immediate, but there will be an impact over time. I don't think we're going
Alex,
to...
It's very interesting, and it's also, if I would want to add something, I had some contacts there on site, especially in the IT sector, and they said to me that it was already a huge lack of IT programmers in Russia, and there was a flow of them abroad, especially Georgia, Uzbekistan, Armenia after February, and now they have to pay them 2 or 3 times more before February to
Yeah.
return back in Russia. So also the cost and the know-how, it's very, let's say, it could be returned back, but with a huge cost for the Russian economy.
There will be huge cost and there will be lower productivity. So as a result, the economy will be, more inefficient. And again, there will be probably pockets of Russia which will be doing fairly well, and Moscow will be doing well because the Kremlin understands that they need to keep Muscovites and St. Petersburg people happy, because it's the big city where unrest can happen, where protests can become dangerous and can endanger the political stability. So these places will be kept okay by Russian standards, and with fewer people being able to travel, it would mean that Russians would accept this situation.
To complete this one, like Gonzalo Ferreira from Portugal, if Russia somehow loses the war, will Putin government drastically lose the support of its people? And completion of his question: if Russia loses the war, could the discontentment of the population be so high that could result in some type of revolution, and could Putin's regime survives?
I think in a scenario where Russia loses the war, Putin's position will become much more vulnerable, but not so much because he would lose support of the people, but he would lose support of his key allies, key people in the elites around him.
Like Siloviki?
Well, yes, basically people who are in the government and who have political influence. So I think the main danger for him will be coming from within the Kremlin rather than from outside the Kremlin walls. Can Russia have a revolution? I don't know, maybe. I don't see a revolutionary situation in Russia now, but that might change over time. It will very much depend on the economic situation in the country and the economic situation in the capital. Even if there is significant deterioration of economic standards in many places across Russia, but not in Moscow, I don't think a revolution would take place because, look, there were these big protests in Khabarovsk in the Far East in 2020 with 100,000 people, every sixth person in Khabarovsk protesting. And what happened? Nothing. Moscow doesn't care about protests in the regions. What the Kremlin cares is that there are no protests in Moscow, or significant protests in Moscow. And they have enough riot police to disperse a protest of 20 or 30, maybe even 50,000 people in Moscow. But they cannot allow a protest of 1 million people, and because that would be dangerous. So I think even with conditions being economically difficult in other parts of the country, Moscow will still be living comfortably. And I think, this trick has been learned in many authoritarian countries. Even in Syria, at the height of the civil war there, people in Damascus lived okay compared to other parts because there were government handouts and there were, the government was paying money and paving roads and providing food and security and services in the capital. Or, in some other authoritarian places where, again, the rest of the country can suffer from significant economic dislocation and economic problems, but the capital would still be living okay by national standards.
Next one, I will take the last 2 or 3, so we'll stay like under the hour as we said. Ramrod, is Russia placing troops in Belarus for a push down the west side of Ukraine to cut off war supplies through Poland, or are there reports of troop build-ups in Belarus false?
I haven't seen credible reports of Russia deploying ground troops in Belarus next to Ukrainian border. We know that there are some Russian sections of the Russian Air Force and of the Russian strategic forces which operate missiles and launch missiles from Belarusian territory, which are present at Belarusian bases. But they are present some distance from Ukrainian border, which is probably for their own protection, because if they would be very close, it would increase likelihood of Ukraine conducting a retaliatory strike on them. But I don't think that at this stage Russia would be trying another attempt to cross from Belarus into Ukraine with ground forces, because it just doesn't have the troops. When Ukraine started talking about a counteroffensive in Kherson in June and July, that was the time when the talking was taking place. Towards the end of July, Russia significantly strengthened its contingent in Kherson to prevent a Ukrainian counteroffensive. But where did these troops came from? They came from Donbass. They were redeployed from the Donetsk direction. They didn't come from Siberia. Russia simply doesn't seem to have the troops. It appears that the Kremlin wants to use the existing contingent of approximately 150,000 troops or so
And move it.
like along the entire Ukrainian front. So they just shift these forces, from one place to another, but they don't send fresh troops. So if suddenly some Russian troops would appear in Belarus close to Ukrainian border, they would probably have to come from Ukrainian territory, which would make that territory vulnerable to Ukrainian counteroffensive. So I'm skeptical at this stage. Again, things might change with Russia conducting partial mobilization, selective mobilization. Just today, we've seen the news that Putin signed a decree that the Russian armed forces will increase by 137,000 from next year. But it cannot be immediate. So that decree will only be effective, and the funding for that decree will only be available from 1st of January next year.
I have like for you one let's say critic question, but let's say it's about the amnesty report that showed that out of 26 schools they visited, 22 have either troops currently there, or is that like your opinion about what it was like in the amnesty report about the schools?
Yeah. My opinion is that Ukraine, as a sovereign country and a UN member state, has a right to self-defense. And Ukrainian armed forces are defending the country and civilian population from a foreign aggression. That means that the armed forces are not always located at military facilities, many of which have been destroyed by Russian strikes. I haven't seen the specific evidence on these schools, but one thing we need to remember: in Ukraine, schools are closed between 1st of June and 1st of September. There are no children in schools because it's summer holidays. Summer holidays are 3 months. It's different from what it is the case in many Western countries. So if I haven't seen specific evidence of the amnesty report, but if, for instance, they were investigating in June and found evidence that there were Ukrainian military at a school gym in June or in July, and that threatened that school with a Russian missile strike, there were no children there and there were no teachers there because the school is not operational in the summer month. But I will go back to what I said earlier. Evidence suggests that Russia hits civilian targets in Ukraine much more frequently, 60 times more frequently than military targets. Yeah. And in my view, what Russia is doing is a genocidal war. It is attempting to kill as many Ukrainians and to cause as much of destruction, of feeling of home, to dislocate the population, and to force to accept the Russian conditions of surrender, of capitulation. This is a tactic which Russia has used in the past, in particularly in Chechnya, which was a civil war within Russian territory, or in Syria, where there has been a lot of evidence of Russian forces conducting strikes on civilian targets. So this is nothing new that we haven't seen before. Russia has done it in Georgia, in Syria, and now it's doing it in Ukraine. So I don't think that the behavior of the Ukrainian army is really endangering Ukrainian civilians. What is really endangering Ukrainian civilians is the fact that Russia began an unprovoked and illegal war against Ukraine and Ukrainian people.
I have a second part still from Maxim, still critic about like a possible war. How can a major war happen when Europe is deindustrialized due to the Russian gas? But we already said, I can show, I made a stream about it, that there will be gas in Russia, but gas in Europe, but at the first time more expensive. By LNG, there is other diversification of the gas suppliers, but the main problem it will be this winter. Inflation and European crashing at the moment. I can say before, like passing to you, that we are decreasing the growth, but it's not in recession. Actually, Russia is still in a contraction of a GDP of more than 7%. Russia estimates the entire NATO arsenal will last only 4 weeks. By this one, I'm completely ignorant. So,
okay, I think an expectation of Europe being deindustrialized is another Russian wishful thinking. I'm skeptical that it will happen. In case if there is no Russian gas, will there be problems for specific sectors of the economy in Europe? Of course there will be. And perhaps there will be recession of a couple of percentage points GDP in a number of EU states. But as you correctly stated, it will be much more modest than the GDP contraction in Russia. In terms of RUSI reports, I haven't seen RUSI reports, so I cannot comment on their findings. What we have seen is that the combat capabilities of Russian armed forces are not particularly impressive. They're only impressive when Russian armed forces are using overwhelming firepower, such as artillery, to strike civilian targets and terrorize civilian populations. When Russian forces actually engage in direct combat with their protagonists, they are not doing particularly well. So what we've seen that Russia in this war has been avoiding direct battles in open fields with Ukrainian armed forces, and rather opting to turn entire Ukrainian cities and into rubble, as has happened with Mariupol, which was a city of nearly 500,000 people and now is largely destroyed to rubble, with Severodonetsk, which had more than 100,000 people of population and now is largely destroyed to rubble. Some of the towns will not be even potentially be reconstructed. The authorities of the Russian appointed administration of Luhansk region in the east of Ukraine, the so-called Luhansk People Republic, said they had no intention of rebuilding Popasna, because which is a town of some 50,000 or so, because it was damaged so badly. So the Russian armed forces can only effectively fight the civilians by just destroying their homes and their cities and killing them in large numbers, as happened yesterday, for instance, in Dnipropetrovsk region, where Russian missile strikes hit a passenger train, killing 25 people and injuring more than 50 people. This was another civilian object which was hit by Russian forces, and another example of Russian war crimes in this war.
I want to show you 2 pages of one book, and then the last 2 questions, and then we will close. So this book, it's a very interesting book that I like a lot. But it's The Last Empire: The Final Days of the Soviet Union. I don't know if you ever read it, yep. But I liked a lot. And there was a lot of sources that were very interesting for me. For example, this one was from October 10th, 1991, before the Ukrainian independence referendum. It was very important that this one is Georgy Shekhnazarov. Like, for the people that don't know, like Russian culture sector, Shekhnazarov, it's not one the son of Georgy. It's one of the best and most famous director of most film. It's like Russian Hollywood. You can see that they were already talking about to stop what they called the Galician nationalist. And this was very important thing that Shekhnazarov proposed that Gorbachev not only repeat publicly but also land on official tone that Russian position with regard of the Crimea, Donbass and southern Ukraine, it should be stated plainly and clearly without constraint that those regions are historically part of Russia and does not intend to renounce when if Ukraine should wish to cease being part of the Union. It's very interesting that this phrase was October 10, 1991. Another one that I wanted to show to you, it was about the diaries of Chernaev, Gorbachev aides. It was very interesting that this phrase, this is the date, it's November 9, 1991, and that Ukraine will leave, and for Crimea, Sevastopol, maybe Donbass and Odessa, they will have to live with Borbulus, that was the prime minister at that time with Yeltsin, and the Ukrainians will have to tighten their tail. For me, it's very interesting to show these sources, because still 30 years ago, they were talking about these...
dismembering Ukraine, yes. Yes, so, but this is a common feature of Russian chauvinism and imperialism, which doesn't take Ukraine seriously and which claims that it is not a real nation, that Ukrainians are not real people, that their language is not real language. This is a very common part of Russian imperialist narrative. But what's important here is, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia and Ukraine have signed multiple international and bilateral agreements which have fixed the borders of the countries. There was the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. There was an agreement on friendship in 1997. And then there was an agreement on the Kharkiv agreements on the basing of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol in Crimea, signed in 2007. All these documents, they specify that the borders between Russia and Ukraine are correct and fixed. So completely throwing off all of this legislation unilaterally by Russia is an attempt to redraw borders by the use of force. And this is not acceptable in the international rules-based order. What Russia is doing, it is behaving like a thug who thinks that if he is, stronger than his neighbor, he can get what he wants. But it doesn't work like this. And I think that Russia picked up a very wrong fight because, again, going back to the economy and that comment about deindustrialized EU, which made me laugh when I read about it. The Russian economy right now is 1.7, last year was 1.7% of global GDP. In terms of Russian GDP, it's smaller than the gross regional product of New York State or of the Guangdong province in the south of China. Russia is not a great power. It thinks it's a great power. It is a medium-sized country in terms of population. Bangladesh has larger population. It is a medium-sized economy, the size of approximately Spain or South Korea. It only looks big on a map thanks to Mercator projection. But it's not a superpower. It's not equal to the United States or to China, for that matter. And to pick a fight with the West is not a strategy which Russia can win in the long term. I think that Russia under Putin will face increased isolation, international isolation, increased economic simplification, and decline in standards of living. Sadly, it has happened with some countries. It has happened in countries like Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Venezuela used to be a rich country in LATAM, not anymore because of the policies chosen by the government. And I think, with the Kremlin's choices of grandeur over economic cooperation and rules-based order, Russia will pay the price, sadly. And sadly, Russian people will pay the price, even those who are not supportive of these policies. Some of them are leaving the country because they don't see their future in the country, with the country becoming increasingly isolated. Are staying, they are facing effective fall in real incomes.
Let me give you, I have like this question and the final one that is the ending, but it's like a fast question and answer the last one. Do you think something will happen with Moldova about this situation or not? Maybe about Transnistria?
I think, well, Russia has a very small military contingent in Transnistria of only about 1,500 people, so they can't do much there. Everything can change if Russians take Mykolaiv and move towards Odessa. But, they haven't been able to do this in the beginning of the war. And I think the ability to do it now is much more constrained. So I'm skeptical that we're gonna see a Russian ground offensive towards Odessa, and without Russian ground offensive towards Odessa, a Russian operation in Moldova would be very high risk operation. Can they, fly helicopters from Crimea and across Ukrainian airspace and to say land in Tiraspol? Yes, they can. But based on what I know, Odessa has air defense systems in place. So it will be very high risk operation.
Like to closing the stream, just as you said in the beginning, but only to synthesize your point of view, what do you suppose will be the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine in the best and the worst case scenario?
Well, as I said, I outlined in the beginning of the discussion 3 scenarios, and obviously I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what will happen. I think obviously the worst scenario for Ukraine would be if Russia manages to, to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses and take significant parts of the country, potentially even take Kiev and install a pro-Russian regime. But that would lead to a civil war, and it will be a horrible scenario for Ukraine. A horrible scenario would be also if Russia uses chemical or nuclear weapons in Ukraine. It would be a horrible scenario, potentially not just for Ukraine, but also for its neighbors, with contamination traveling across international borders. What would be the best scenario? Of course, Russian defeat and liberation of territories captured by Russia, including Kherson, including Mariupol, including Severodonetsk, but potentially even Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. And while until recently I was skeptical that Ukraine would even dare to go into Crimea, now I think the calculus has changed, because we've seen these incidents, security incidents in Crimea in August, which were likely Ukrainian attacks. It's not clear, what was the delivery method of these attacks. But it's more likely that these were not incidents as Russia claimed, but these were Ukrainian attacks. And it shows that Ukraine has both intent and capability to conduct these strikes. Military assets in Crimea, Russian military assets in Crimea, in order to disrupt Russian military operations in the south of Ukraine. For instance, when that explosion in Jankoy happened, it was an ammunition depot located next to the railway, and Jankoy is the main railway hub for entire Crimea. So no trains could operate in Crimea at all, because all trains from anywhere to anywhere in Crimea, they go via Jankoy. It's the main hub where 4 lines connect. So I no longer think that Crimea is in the cards. Perhaps, if you would have asked me back in July, I would say, probably, Ukraine would not even dare to go into Crimea, because Russia claims that Crimea it's Russia. So Russia can escalate and use whatever weapons they want to protect it. What Russia is doing, Russia is lying. Russia is saying, it was just an accidental fire. It didn't happen. Well, if this is the Russian tactic, then probably there will be more accidental fires.
It was very interesting for me also a little bit change of position of Erdogan that a few days ago.
Yes,
it was very supportive with the return back of Crimea to Ukraine. I was completely shocked about, for example, their position, because Turkey it's a little bit like with 1 foot and 2 socks.
We've seen that Turkey has attempted to place itself as an intermediary between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the West, where it was, setting aside. Turkey didn't introduce any sanctions against Russia, economic sanctions, So Turkey still trades actively with Russia. But yes, that change of tone was very interesting, and it probably indicates, some information or assessment which is not in the public domain, but is available to the decision makers in places such as Ankara. The fact that he has changed the tone, because on 18th he traveled to Lviv to basically try to negotiate ceasefire talks between Putin and Zelensky. He said that he would offer, any location in Turkey for negotiations, but now, basically a week later, he completely changes the tone and he says that Russian occupation is illegal and we will not recognize it, and that's it.
So let's see. So I wanted to thank you so much for your speech. I hope that all the viewers liked your contribution, I'm sure. For anybody that wants to put extra question, just put in the comments. We went over 15 minutes from the hour that we wanted to do, but it was because we had a lot of questions. And if you liked the contents, please make a like to the video, subscribe to the channel. We will have a lot of speeches in the next weeks and a lot of news. So still, thank you, Alex, for your speech, and see you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.